Hello and welcome to Lecture 2. And in this lecture, we are going to be talking about the public policy process. So what are we going to be learning about in this lecture? Well, we're going to learn about the steps in the policymaking process, and then we're going to use the example of Title IX to bring those different steps to life. So let's get started. Okay, so how is public policy made? Well, there are many different models that are used to explain the public policy making process. And in fact, in one of the chapters that you're going to be reading for this week, you're only going to be reading part of the second chapter, and it'll be designated on the PDF where you should stop reading. But when you look at the rest of the chapter, the second chapter, you'll see that there's other models that are used to explain the policymaking process. But in this class, since it's sort of an introductory policy class, we're going to be looking at one of the models that they talk about in chapter 2, and they just talk a little bit about it in chapter 2 in that PDF that you'll be reading. So I'm going to add more details in this lecture to the material that is offered in the textbook. And the starting point that we're going to be using is what's known as the policy making process. And what's cool about this model is it's kind of like the ideal model. It's a model that sees policymaking as a predictable political activity with well-established steps. Now, if you were taking a straight-up class on public policy, we'd be looking at all of the different models. And we usually start with the policymaking process model. But what we find is that when public policy is really made, there are other factors that are taken into consideration, and that it's not always a predictable political activity with well-established steps. But it's a good introductory place to start. So let's look at the different steps in the model. Okay, so here is an overview or a listing of the steps that are in the public policy making process. Now I'm going to list these up here, and we're just going to present them. But then we're going to use Title IX as an example to actually define these and bring them to life. So the first step is problem identification and agenda setting. The second step is policy formation and legitimation. The third step is policy implementation. And the fourth step is policy evaluation. And as I said, we're going to use Title IX as an example to bring each of these different steps to light. But I just wanted to put them up there so that you sort of could see the trajectory that we're taking through the course of this lecture. Okay, so what is Title IX? Well, Title IX, you're going to be learning more about Title IX. We have a whole chapter that's dedicated to education equity. But this will just kind of give you a taste of what Title IX is. Well, Title IX is a federal law that prohibits sex discrimination in any school that receives federal funding. It is a part of the Higher Education and Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It's an amendment to that, and it's sometimes known as the Educational Amendment of 1972, not that that necessarily matters. But what the Title IX states is that no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subject to discrimination under any educational program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So it basically prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in federally funded educational institutions. A lot of times when we think about Title IX, we think about equity in terms of sports, but there's more to Title IX than that. So how does Title IX impact our lives? Well, one way it impacts your life is if you are a student at a federally funded institution of education, or if you're an employee at an institution of education that receives federal funds. So students and employees cannot be subject to discrimination due to gender, pregnancy, marital status, or parenthood. And so it prevents that discrimination on the basis of sex in educational facilities. It guarantees gender equity in sports and educational facilities that receive federal funds. And a lot of educational facilities, institutions receive federal funds, okay? So it's not just public schools that this applies to, but private schools also receive federal funds in the form of federal student aid, etc. That uh, institutions of education must address sexual violence because it impedes free and equal access to education. And we'll be learning more about that when we talk about sexual harassment and sexual assault. And it protects transgender students so that the discrimination on the basis of sex has been extended to protecting transgender and gender nonconforming students, that their gender identity must be respected. There was during the that started in the President Obama's administration. President Trump backed off from that, but President Biden has provided those protections again for transgender and gender nonconforming students. Okay, so let's look at the first step in the policymaking process, and we'll broadly define it, and then we'll use Title IX to bring more specific examples to this first step. So the first step is problem identification and agenda setting. And so problem identification is where individuals and groups demand the government address a perceived problem or perceived issue. And that's what your textbook talks about as a policy debate. There's basically an argument over an issue, and the issue that is focused on is this a problem? Like, is this a problem that government should do something about? And that policy debate often takes place within what's known as a policy community. So a policy community is a network of actors, lawmakers, activists, interest groups, maybe even bureaucrats as well. And they agree that there is a problem, but they may not agree on what the best solution to the problem is. But they work together, lawmakers, interest groups, activists, they work together in order to get this issue identified as a problem and persuade lawmakers in Congress broadly to take some action on it. Agenda setting is focusing the attention of the public, focusing the attention of the media and of public officials on this issue. The point is that you want the debate to not just take place among a small group of people, but you want to take this debate about a perceived problem, you want that to take place in a broad public arena. And having that debate take place in the media, where you can have people appear on the media and talk about the problem and potential solutions to it, that can apply pressure to lawmakers to get a problem on the agenda and to do something about it. Okay, so what was the perceived problem that brought about Title IX? So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits racial discrimination in schools, but it does not prohibit gender discrimination in schools. And so coming out of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, you couldn't tell somebody that you couldn't deny somebody admissions into a federally funded institution of higher education because of their race, but you could because of their gender. And that was perceived as a problem. The policy debate is treating women differently in education justified? Is there a good reason for saying that women can be discriminated when it comes to applying to medical school or applying to law school? And the result of the policy debate was no, it's not justified. And that discrimination on the basis of sex in federally funded educational institutions must end, okay? And so that was basically that identification of the problem, that you can't discriminate in educational settings on the basis of race, and you shouldn't be able to do it on the basis of gender either. There was a policy community that developed around trying to raise awareness and to get this issue of ending sex discrimination in education on the agenda of the broader, Congress. And the policy community that it involved, several different groups and actors. And so the NOW, which is the National Organization of Women, and WHEEL, which is Women's Equity Action League, they were at the forefront of drawing attention as a women's rights groups to the issue of sex discrimination in educational facilities. The activist Bernice Sandler, she actually filed many suits. She filed suits for sex discrimination against the University of Maryland as they were preventing her from moving to a part-time position to a full-time position, and she felt that they wouldn't move her to a full-time position because of her sex. And then there were two members of Congress, Edith Green and Patsy Mink, who served on served on the subcommittee for higher education. And so they brought the attention of sex discrimination to Congress. And then Senator Birch Bayh was the one who actually introduced Title IX on the floor of the Senate. And so it's a good example of bringing that first step of problem identification and agenda setting to life. And here are some photos of Bernice Sanders on the one side, and women associated with Now on the other side, marching to bring attention to equality for women. Bernice Sandler, she worked at, as I mentioned, she worked at the University of Maryland, and she was having, as a part-time instructor, and she was having a hard time securing a full-time faculty position. And she was the reason is they told her that she came on too strong for a woman, right? And so she was like, whoa, what do you mean by that? And she felt that was, and indeed it is, discriminatory. So she filed suit against the University of Maryland, saying that she had been denied promotion on the basis of gender, because of gender discrimination. And her, Bernice Sandler's her lawsuits grabbed the attention of many policymakers, including, as I mentioned, Patsy Minsk and Edith Green of Oregon. So her actions and the actions of Now spurred the actions of members of representatives to get it on the agenda in Congress. Okay, so let's take a look at the next step: policy formation and policy legitimation. And in this, we're just going to talk broadly about it. And on the next slide, we'll use specific examples from Title IX. Policy formation is the creation of public policy by lawmakers, and they sometimes get assistance from interest groups and think tanks. And so policy formation is when you sit down in Congress and you'll have a couple of senators or a couple of representatives who will basically work with others to craft the language for a specific public policy. And so they will formulate that, and then they will enter it in to be considered by either the House, or they'll submit the bill to be considered by the House or the Congress. But it starts with actually being able to articulate what that policy is. And policy legitimation is when that bill actually becomes law. And so it'll be the passage of the bill by Congress, and then the signing that bill into law by the president, and then ultimately, too, the court weighing in and saying, you know what, this policy is in fact legitimate because it is constitutional. Okay? And so those are the two, that's a broad sort of overview of those policy formation and legitimation. And so how did this play itself out? How did policy formulation and legitimation play itself out with Title IX? Well, it was language that was crafted by senators, and it was introduced as an amendment to the Higher Education Act of 1965 by Senator Bayh of Indiana. It passed Congress with very strong support. In the Senate, it was a vote of 88-6, and in the House, it was 275 to 125. And then it was signed into law by President Nixon on June 23rd, 1972. And here we have on the left Representative Patsy Mink and Representative Edith Green, who were the co-authors of the draft of Title IX, and then Senator Bayh was the one who introduced it into the Senate. And then it was signed into law by President Nixon right there. You might think, President Nixon, he was a Republican. Why would he be supportive of Title IX? Well, newsflash, the Republican Party was supportive of equal rights for women. They supported until the 1980s, and we're going to be learning about this in class. Until the 1980s, both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party had people in those parties and in positions of power who were supportive of abortion rights for women, who were supportive of the Equal Rights Amendment, and were supportive, obviously, here of Title IX. It wasn't until the 1980s where the Conservative Party begins to get much more conservative and they stop supporting these issues regarding gender equality. But President Nixon is a good example of a Republican who was supportive of these kinds of laws. And that brings us to policy implementation and policy evaluation. So policy implementation is the realization of policy via bureaucracies. That you pass a law, you sign it in, the president signs it in and enacts it, but then it's handed over to the federal bureaucracies, all of those different departments that are related to the implementation of this policy, and then they actually have to work out the details of putting the policy into force, and it's at this step that actually plays itself out. Regulations are created, money is appropriated in order to implement the law. I'll use the example of the Affordable Care Act. When the Affordable Care Act was signed into law, there were some vague aspects of the law. One aspect was that it said that certain essential health care would be covered by the Affordable Care Act, right? That when somebody was insured, insurance companies had to cover certain essential healthcare items. It was sort of like, well, what is essential healthcare? Like, what's going to be covered by insurance? And that had not been designated in the law. It hadn't been completely worked out. So when the law was implemented, it went to the Department of Health and Human Services, and it was there that they sort of defined what essential health care was, and in fact, that they defined it as including for women contraceptives. Okay, so that policy implementation is a really important part in the process, because it's really where we figure out the nuts and bolts of how this law is actually going to be executed. And then there's policy evaluation. And this is the analysis of the policy post-implementation, asking the question, is this policy actually achieving the goals that it was set out to achieve? So how did policy implementation work out for Title IX? Well, it was a very short amendment. I mean, you actually saw the language of it. And so the full realization of how do we implement the end of discrimination on the basis of sex, that full realization was realized through the federal bureaucracy. It was at the time the Department of Education is responsible today for the realization and the continued implementation of Title IX. But the Department of Education did not exist at the time of the passage of the Title IX. That department was Health, Education, and Welfare. And so they were charged with implementing it. We're going to learn more about this when we get to the chapter on Title IX, but that there was a conceptual framework. There was widespread acceptance of gender equity in secondary and higher education, but there was a lot of disagreement over how best to achieve this. There was disagreement about sports and which sports should be subject to gender equity. Should football scholarships be counted towards gender equity, and that we have to match the number of scholarships that are on the football team, and if you don't do that, then there's not gender equity. There was a lot of concern about that. There was concern about textbooks and should there be gender neutral language, etc. So you'll learn more about that as we move through the course of the semester, but that there was widespread acceptance that there should be gender equity, but how to achieve it, there was disagreement, and that disagreement sort of played itself out in the way that Title IX was implemented. And now to the final step, which is policy evaluation and how that played itself out with Title IX. The question has been and continues to be what is the impact of Title IX? Is Title IX really doing a good job of addressing discrimination on the basis of sex in institutions of education? And there's been a lot of, questions. Has it achieved its goals? Where does it fall short? Are there any unintended consequences? Some of the things that we're going to be talking about in this semester is one of the places that Title IX has fallen short in terms of its implementation is the failure of universities to take seriously sexual harassment and sexual violence. That's changed recently, but in some of the early evaluations of policy of Title IX, that was one of the places where it was identified as falling short, that there were still and continues to be sexual harassment and sexual violence on campus that needs to be addressed, and it's being more effectively addressed today. Also, unintended consequences, the adverse impact that Title IX has had on men's sports. I come from a family, my husband's side, where they have wrestlers, male wrestlers in their family. They like to complain about Title IX because they're like, you know what, with gender equity, and you have to have, equal scholarships, that rather than creating more women's sports, they're just cutting lowly enrolled or less popular men's sports like wrestling. And that is, it has an adverse effect and a potential unintended consequence. All right. Well, that's it from me. Hopefully this kind of brought the public policy process to light for you through Title IX. And if you have any questions about any of these steps, don't hesitate to contact me or to show up to Zoom office hours because I'd be more than happy to talk about them. All right. Talk to you again soon. Later. Bye.